In the grim darkness of the far future, there are fates that make death seem like mercy. Among the countless horrors that stalk the galaxy, few are as cruel as falling into the hands of the greenskin menace. For those who have known wealth, power, and privilege within the Imperium of man, the reversal of fortune is especially devastating when an orc horde comes calling. This is the story of what happens when the elite of human civilization encounter creatures that cannot comprehend, much less respect, the trappings of status that once defined their victims' entire existence. The anatomy of a nightmare. Understanding the orc mind. Before we can truly grasp the horror that awaits a wealthy captive in orc hands, we must first understand what manner of beings these greenskins truly are. The orcs are not simply brutal aliens with a penchant for violence. They are something far more alien, far more incomprehensible to the human mind. They are living weapons, genetic constructs created millions of years ago during the legendary war in heaven by the mysterious Old Ones, sometimes referred to in orc legend as the Brain Boys. The orcs were engineered to be the ultimate survivors and warriors. Their physiology is a complex interweaving of animal and fungal biology, granting them regenerative capabilities that border on the miraculous. An orc can survive wounds that would kill a human 10 times over. They can be beheaded and, if their head is reattached to another body quickly enough, they will survive to fight again. Their green skin, likely the result of some form of algae or fungus permeating their cellular structure, can repair damage at an incredible rate. Pain and fear mean little to them. What would traumatize a human is merely interesting to an orc, perhaps even amusing. But it is their psychology that makes them truly alien. Orcs do not fight out of necessity, or to acquire resources, or to defend territory. They fight because fighting is what they were created to do. It is their purpose, their joy, their entire reason for being. The concept of peace is not just undesirable to them, it is literally incomprehensible. They cannot understand why other species would want to avoid conflict. To an orc, the idea that someone might build fortifications or develop weapons as a deterrent to war is baffling. They see such things as challenges, invitations to test themselves against whatever defenses have been erected. This fundamental disconnect between orc psychology and that of every other sentient species in the galaxy is crucial to understanding what happens to those who fall into their clutches. When an orc looks at a wealthy human draped in fine clothes, bedecked with status symbols, and surrounded by the trappings of power, they do not see what the human wants them to see. They do not recognize authority or privilege. They see only another soft, weak creature that might be useful for labor, or entertaining in its suffering, or simply edible. The orcs possess a form of collective psychic power, a gestalt field that emerges when enough of them gather together. This field has the remarkable property of making their beliefs become reality. If orcs believe that red vehicles go faster, then red vehicles driven by orcs do indeed go faster. If they believe that a weapon cobbled together from scrap and faith will fire, then fire it does. This same psychic phenomenon reinforces their social structures and their understanding of the universe. They believe that might makes right, that the biggest is the best, that strength determines status. This belief is so powerful that it shapes reality itself within orc society. To an orc, size matters above all else. A larger orc is naturally more important, more worthy of respect than a smaller one. The teeth in an orc's head, particularly the large tusks, serve as both weapons and status symbols. Bigger tusks mean a more important orc, and those teeth, constantly growing and replacing themselves like a shark's, form the entire basis of the orc economy. Teeth, as they call them, are the only currency that matters in greenskin society. Human teeth are too small, too pathetic to have any value. Human gold means nothing. Human titles are empty sounds. Human wealth is measured in things that, to an orc, might as well not exist at all. The moment of capture, when status dies, screaming. The invasion comes without warning, as most do. Perhaps it is a raid on a merchant vessel traversing the void between stars. Perhaps it is a planetary assault where the local PDF forces crumble before the green tide. Perhaps it is the fall of a hive city, its billions of souls suddenly prey to creatures that view them as little more than cattle. The specifics vary, but the pattern remains consistent. Where orcs attack, civilization dies, and those who cannot flee or fight effectively become property of the conquerors. For our wealthy victim, let us call him Coordinator Hieronymus Valdane. The invasion of his world began with sirens. He was a man of considerable standing, a trade coordinator for one of the minor noble houses of the Segmentum Obscurus. His position afforded him luxuries that most citizens of the Imperium would never dream of experiencing. He wore robes of the finest cloth, dyed in colors that required the labor of hundreds to produce. His fingers bore rings of precious metals, each one worth more than a common worker would earn in a lifetime. His residence occupied the upper levels of a hive spire, where the air was clean and the view of the planet's surface was unobscured by the pollution that choked the lower levels. Valdane had never experienced true hardship. His position was inherited, his wealth maintained through the labor of others. When the alarms began to wail, announcing the arrival of an orc fleet in the system, his first response was not fear, but irritation. Surely the planetary defense forces would handle this. Surely his position would afford him protection. Surely someone would ensure his safety. The defense forces did not handle it. The orc fleet, a ramshackle collection of space hulks and looted vessels held together as much by belief as by welding, descended upon the system like a green tsunami. The orbital defenses put up resistance, to be sure. Ships were destroyed. Orcs died by the thousands. But for every greenskin vessel that was obliterated, 2 more seemed to appear. The orcs kept coming because that is what orcs do. They are driven not by strategy or logistics, but by an overwhelming compulsion to fight. Loss of life means nothing to them. Tactical disadvantage is simply another challenge to overcome through sheer, brutal aggression. When the orc assault boats began to fall on the hive city like meteors of scrap and fury, Valdane finally understood that his wealth and position might not save him. He attempted to flee, as did millions of others. The spaceports were overwhelmed within hours. The roads became rivers of desperate humanity, and through it all, the orcs came. They fell from the sky in crude drop pods that should not have worked but did, because the orcs believed they would. They smashed through defensive lines that had held against lesser threats for centuries. They laughed as they killed, roared as they destroyed, and generally had the time of their lives, while the human defenders died in terror. Valdane's luxurious transport, a gleaming vehicle that represented more wealth than entire families would see in generations, was torn apart by orc war buggies within minutes of leaving his residence. The driver, a loyal servant who had been with Valdane's family for 20 years, was pulled from the controls and beaten to death with casual indifference. Valdane himself was dragged from the wreckage by a massive green hand. The orc that held him, a creature easily 8 feet tall and broader than 2 men standing side by side, looked at him with small, pig-like eyes that held no recognition of Valdane's status, no understanding of his importance. The orc sniffed him, a gesture that Valdane would later understand was assessment rather than curiosity. It was determining whether he was worth keeping or whether he should be eaten on the spot. Fortunately, or perhaps unfortunately, for Valdane, the orc was in a hurry. There were still defenders to fight, still things to smash and loot. Food could wait. The green skin roughly bound Valdane's hands with what appeared to be a length of rusted chain, attached him to a group of other captives that had been gathered, and shoved the entire collection toward the rear of the orc advance. Valdane found himself stumbling through streets he no longer recognized. past buildings he had passed daily now reduced to burning ruins. The fine robes that had marked his status were torn and filthy. The rings on his fingers, symbols of his wealth and position, went completely unnoticed by his captors. When he tried to speak, to explain who he was, to offer payment for his release, the Rundard, overseeing the captive column, simply struck him across the face with the butt of its weapon. The message was clear, even if Valdane could not understand the guttural language the creature used to deliver it. Shut up and keep moving. Around him, other captives told the same story through their presence. A merchant in fine clothes, weeping openly. A minor noble, her jewels and finery torn and stained. A wealthy factory owner, his augmetic implants sparking from damage. A priest of the ecclesiarchy, his vestments of office providing no protection from rough handling. All of them had been important. All of them had held status in the society that was now burning around them, and none of it mattered even slightly to the orcs herding them like cattle. The journey to the orc encampment took hours, hours of stumbling over rubble, of being struck for moving too slowly, of watching others fall and be left behind without a second glance from their captors. Valdane's expensive boots, crafted by master artisans to be comfortable and impressive, were never designed for this kind of trek. They began to fall apart within the first mile. By the time the captive column reached its destination, Valdane was barefoot, his feet bloody and raw. The pain was unlike anything he had experienced. He had lived a life where discomfort was immediately addressed, where servants attended to his every need. Now he bled and suffered, and no one cared. The orc encampment was a nightmare given physical form. Crude structures of salvaged metal and concrete dominated the landscape. Massive war machines stood in various states of repair, surrounded by smaller greenskins that Valdane would later learn were called Gretchen. Fires burned everywhere, sending plumes of black smoke into the darkening sky. The air was thick with the stench of burning promethium, unwashed bodies, and something else, something organic and foul that Valdane could not identify. The sounds were overwhelming. The roar of engines, the clang of metal on metal, the guttural laughter and shouting of the orcs as they celebrated their victory. The first lesson: everything you were means nothing. The captives were driven into a large open area that might once have been a plaza or parade ground. Hundreds of humans were already there, huddled together in groups defined more by fear than any social organization. Orcs patrolled the perimeter, weapons ready, while smaller Gretchen scurried about with brands and tools. Valdane and his group were shoved into the mass of captive humanity, and for the first time since his capture, the orcs left them relatively unsupervised. Valdane immediately sought out others of status, a reflex born of decades of social hierarchy. He found them: nobles, merchants, military officers still in torn uniforms. They gathered together, a small island of former privilege in a sea of common suffering. They spoke in hushed tones of rescue, of ransom, of surely someone noticing their disappearance and mounting a recovery operation. They convinced themselves that their importance would matter, that wealth and position had to count for something. They were, of course, completely wrong. The Rundard that approached their group was a particularly grizzled specimen, scarred and brutal even by orc standards. It carried a long pole, topped with what appeared to be an electric prod, which it used with casual efficiency. It pointed at the gathered nobles and wealthy merchants, barked something in its guttural tongue, and when they did not immediately comply, began using the prod. The shocks were agonizing, dropping grown men and women to the ground in convulsing heaps. The message was clear: status from the old life meant nothing here. Valdane watched as a lord militant, a man who commanded thousands of troops, was beaten unconscious for protesting his treatment. He saw a wealthy dowager, a woman who controlled vast commercial interests, dragged away by her hair when she refused to move quickly enough. He learned, in those first hours, that everything he had been was gone. The wealth, the status, the comfort, the respect, all of it had evaporated the moment the orcs arrived. As night fell, the captives were herded into crude pens, structures of scrap metal and chain link that wouldn't have been considered fit for animals in the old life. No food was provided, no water, no shelter from the elements. The Orks simply assumed that if the captives got hungry or thirsty enough, they would deal with it themselves. And if some of them died, well, there were always more humans to capture. The galaxy was full of them. Valdane spent that first night huddled in a corner of the pen, trying to comprehend the totality of his situation. Around him, others wept or prayed or simply sat in shocked silence. Some tried to maintain the distinctions of their former lives, addressing each other by titles that no longer had any meaning. Others accepted the new reality more quickly, understanding that survival would require adapting to circumstances that bore no resemblance to anything they had known. The dawn brought new horrors and new understandings. A group of Gretchen entered the pen carrying crude brands, heated metal rods that glowed with malicious intent. One by one, the captives were grabbed, held down by the small but surprisingly strong creatures, and branded. The symbol burned into their flesh was a simple glyph, a mark of ownership that designated them as property of the warband. The screams of the branded echoed across the encampment, and the Orks barely noticed. This was routine. This was simply how things were done. When Valdane's turn came, he tried to resist, tried to explain, tried to offer anything that might spare him the pain. The Gretchen didn't understand and didn't care. They burned the mark into his shoulder, and the agony was unlike anything his comfortable life had prepared him for. When they released him, he fell to the ground, clutching the burn, and wept for the first time since childhood. Not just from the pain, though that was considerable, but from the understanding that had finally, truly penetrated his shock. He was nothing now, just another piece of property in an economy that measured value only in immediate utility. The Ork economy, why wealth means nothing. To truly understand the futility of Valdane's position and the position of all wealthy humans who fall into Ork hands, we must examine the greenskin economy in detail. It is a system so alien to human understanding that even explaining it requires framing it in terms that don't quite capture its essential nature. Orks use their teeth, specifically their large tusks, as currency. They call them teeth, and they form the entire basis of greenskin commerce. This is not arbitrary. Ork teeth have several properties that make them ideal as money. First, every Ork grows them throughout their life, constantly replacing them like a shark. This means that every Ork has access to at least some currency, preventing the complete destitution that plagues human economies. Second, the teeth degrade over time, making it impossible to hoard them indefinitely. This creates a natural pressure to spend rather than save, keeping the economy in constant motion. Third, the size and quality of the teeth reflect the size and status of the Ork they came from, creating an inherent value hierarchy. A single tough will buy a good squig pie and a tankard of fungus beer. A bag of teeth might purchase a cheap war buggy. A big, flashy battle wagon could cost hundreds of teeth. The wealthiest Orks, particularly those of the Bad Moons clan, whose teeth grow faster than others, might accumulate enough teeth to buy truly impressive weapons and armor. But even these wealthy greenskins can never hoard wealth indefinitely. The teeth decay, the money disappears. Spend it or lose it becomes not just a philosophy, but a physical necessity. For human captives, this economic system creates an insurmountable problem. Human teeth are too small, too pathetic to have any value in Ork society. The wealth that Valdane represented, measured in thrones or credits or whatever currency his world used, is completely meaningless. The precious metals in his rings. The Orks might appreciate shiny things, but as currency, as a means of buying freedom or better treatment, they're worthless. The Orks value size and strength. A human, even a wealthy one, has neither. The only value a human captive possesses is their labor, their entertainment value, or their caloric content. This is perhaps the most devastating realization for those of former privilege. Everything they spent their lives accumulating, every symbol of status they wore, every connection they cultivated, all of it is utterly irrelevant. An orc nob, the greenskin equivalent of nobility, achieves his status through size and violence. He maintains it through the same means. His wealth is measured in teeth he can extract from other orcs, either through trade or through literally knocking them out of their heads. The concept of inherited wealth, of status divorced from physical prowess, is alien to them. Valdane learned this lesson when he attempted to bargain with a mech boy for better treatment. He offered his rings, explaining their value, their rarity, their significance. The mech boy, a greenskin specialist in engineering, whose knowledge was genetically encoded rather than learned, looked at the tiny rings with something approaching amusement. It took them, certainly, but not because they had value. It took them because they were shiny and might be incorporated into some device or decoration. Valdane got nothing in return. The concept of exchange, of quid pro quo, existed in orc society, but it operated on a completely different basis than anything the human understood. The mech boy already had what it needed from Valdane: access to his labor. Whether Valdane worked willingly or unwillingly made no difference to the greenskin. Whether he was comfortable or suffering was irrelevant. The mech boy would use Valdane's hands to hold tools, to fetch materials, to perform tasks that the orc considered beneath its attention. If Valdane did well, he might avoid being beaten for a day. If he did poorly, he would suffer. That was the extent of their economic relationship. There was no room for negotiation, no possibility of buying better treatment, no chance of using wealth to secure advantage. Life in the labor camps, the erasure of identity. The weeks that followed Valdane's capture blurred together into a nightmare of labor and survival. The Orc warband had established what could generously be called a labor camp, though that term implies a level of organization and structure that didn't really exist. It was more accurate to call it a collection point for useful slaves, a place where the Orcs gathered humans who could be worked until they broke. The work itself varied, but shared certain characteristics. It was brutal, it was dangerous, and it was never-ending. Valdane found himself assigned to the scrapyards that surrounded the Orc workshops. His job, along with hundreds of others, was to haul raw materials from the massive piles of salvage to the workshops where mech boys and their assistants worked on vehicles and weapons. The scrap was heavy, often sharp, sometimes still hot from recent fires. Safety was not a concept the Orcs bothered with. If a slave was injured by falling debris or cut themselves on jagged metal, that was their problem to solve. The other captives in Valdane's work group represented a cross-section of the world that had been. There was Kyrios, a former military officer who still tried to maintain some semblance of order and discipline among the workers. There was Malika, a merchant who had dealt in exotic fabrics and now found her delicate hands torn and bleeding from handling scrap metal. There was Torvin, a tech priest whose augmetic implants had been crudely removed by the Orcs, leaving him diminished and in constant pain. And there were dozens of others, each with their own story of former lives and present suffering. In the beginning, the former people of status tried to maintain their identities. They addressed each other by titles. They spoke of their past accomplishments. They created hierarchies among themselves based on what they had been before. But the Orcs didn't recognize these distinctions, and eventually, neither could the captives themselves. When everyone is equally brutalized, when everyone suffers the same deprivations and endures the same casual cruelties, the old distinctions begin to seem ridiculous. What did it matter that Valdane had once coordinated trade worth millions, when he couldn't even secure an extra ration of the foul gruel that passed for food? The food was another horror unto itself. The Orcs provided their slaves with the absolute minimum needed to keep them working. Sometimes it was fungus-based bread that tasted like moldy earth. Sometimes it was squig meat, tough and gamey, from creatures the captives were better off not seeing while they were alive. Sometimes it was nothing, and the slaves had to make do with whatever they could scavenge. Water was available from crude troughs that were refilled irregularly. Disease was rampant. The Orks didn't care. If a slave died, there were always more to replace them. Valdane lost weight rapidly. His soft body, maintained through a lifetime of comfort and excess, began to waste away. His muscles, unused to manual labor, screamed in agony at the end of each day. His hands, which had never done more than sign documents and gesture in meetings, became calloused and scarred. The expensive creams and treatments that had maintained his appearance were gone. His skin became weathered. His teeth, ironically, began to rot from poor nutrition. He was transforming physically into something he would not have recognized in his old life. But the physical changes were nothing compared to the psychological erosion, the constant brutality, the casual violence, the utter disregard for human dignity. All of it wore away at the person Valdane had been. He began to measure success not in profits or status, but in simpler terms. Did he avoid being beaten today? Did he get enough food to dull the hunger? Did he find a spot in the sleeping pens that was relatively dry and free of the worst vermin? The Gretchens served as the immediate overseers of the slave laborers. These small, goblin-like creatures were barely above slaves themselves in Orc society, existing in constant fear of their larger cousins. They took out their frustrations on the human captives with enthusiasm. A Gretchen carrying a shock prod was a petty tyrant, able to inflict pain on beings much larger than itself without consequence. They seemed to especially enjoy targeting those who had clearly been wealthy or important in their former lives, as if recognizing that these humans had fallen further and took pleasure in their degradation. The Runthards were worse. These were Orks whose role was to manage the Gretchen, Snotlings, and other lesser beings in the warband's service. They viewed human slaves as essentially equivalent to Gretchen, tools to be used and discarded. A Runthard carried whips, prods, and clubs, and used them liberally. They had no concept of measured discipline or proportional response. If a slave worked too slowly, they were beaten. If they worked too quickly and made mistakes, they were beaten. If they simply happened to be in the Runthard's way when it was in a bad mood, they were beaten. The violence was random, capricious, and unending. Valdane witnessed horrors during these weeks that would haunt him for whatever remained of his life. He saw slaves worked literally to death, their bodies discarded in refuse piles when they could no longer perform. He saw captives dragged away by pain boys, the Orc surgeons, for experiments and procedures that few survived intact. He saw the strong victimize the weak, as human social structures broke down under the pressure of survival. He saw former friends betray each other for an extra scrap of food. He saw the complete dissolution of everything that civilized humans claimed made them better than animals. There were attempts at maintaining humanity. Kyrios organized small groups to share resources more fairly, to protect the weakest among them. A former priest, Father Domitian, held quiet services in the darkness of the sleeping pens, offering what comfort faith could provide. Some captives formed bonds, relationships of mutual support that helped them endure. But these efforts were fragile things, constantly threatened by the grinding reality of their situation. Valdane found himself part of a small group that included Malika, Torven, and a few others. They looked out for each other when possible, shared what little they could, and provided the emotional support that kept despair at bay. But even these relationships were colored by their circumstances. There was no deep trust, no true intimacy. Everyone knew that survival might require sacrificing others. Everyone understood that the bonds they formed were temporary, liable to be severed by death or transfer or simple exhaustion of the will to care. The workshops of madness, mech boys, and their peculiar logic. Valdane's assignment eventually changed. After proving himself capable of following instructions and surviving the brutal labor of the scrapyards, he was transferred to work directly in one of the mech boy workshops. This was, in some ways, a promotion. The work was less physically demanding, though no less dangerous. but it brought him into closer contact with the Orks themselves, and this proximity revealed the true depths of their alien nature. The mech boy, who became Valdane's primary overseer, was called Skragdaka by the other Orks, though Valdane never knew if this was a name or a description or some combination of both. Skragdaka was large even for an Ork, perhaps 9 feet tall when fully upright, though it usually hunched over the workbenches where it performed its craft. Its skin was a deep green, almost black in the shadows of the workshop. Its hands, massive and powerful, could tear metal with casual strength, yet could also perform surprisingly delicate work when the mech boy's attention was focused. The workshop itself was chaos given physical form. There was no organization that Valdane could discern, no system of tool storage or part inventory. Pieces of vehicles, weapons, and unidentifiable machinery lay scattered across every surface. The floor was ankle-deep in metal shavings and discarded parts. The air was thick with the smell of burning promethium furs, hot metal, and something organic that Valdane tried not to think about too deeply. Sparks flew constantly as welders worked. The clang of hammers on metal provided a constant percussion. And through it all, Skragdaka moved with purpose, assembling devices that should not have worked but somehow did. Valdane's role was to assist. This meant holding tools, fetching parts, and generally serving as an extra pair of hands when the mech boy needed them. It also meant bearing witness to the fundamentally incomprehensible nature of Ork technology. Skragdaka would weld together pieces that didn't fit, connect wiring in ways that violated every principle of engineering Valdane understood, and add components that served no discernible function. And yet, when the device was complete, and the mech boy believed it would work, it did. There was the time Skragdaka built what appeared to be a gun from pieces of scrap, a length of pipe, and what Valdane could have sworn was part of a cooking pot. The mech boy had no blueprints, no plans, no measurements. It simply assembled pieces until it was satisfied, then declared the weapon complete. When it fired the thing at a target, the shot tore through armor plating. It shouldn't have worked. The barrel wasn't properly rifled. The firing mechanism was a disaster of improvisation. But the mech boy believed it would work, and that belief, amplified by the Gestalt psychic field all Orks generated, made it so. Valdane tried to learn the principles governing this mad science, thinking that understanding might somehow help him. But there were no principles, not in any sense he could grasp. The Orks didn't understand their own technology in the way humans did. Their knowledge was instinctive, genetic, encoded into their very being by whoever or whatever created them. A mech boy didn't learn engineering. It simply knew things about machines the way a human knows how to breathe. This knowledge was deeply practical, but utterly unconcerned with theory or consistency. The other workers in the shop included several Gretchen, who served as apprentices and gophers, a few humans in various states of exhaustion and injury, and occasionally other Orks who came to commission work or deliver materials. Valdane learned to make himself invisible when the larger Orks were present. They had a tendency to lash out when frustrated, and anything in reach when they were angry might become the target of that anger. He saw a Gretchen killed by a casual backhand when an Ork was displeased with its work. The body was simply dragged out and left in the scrap pile. No ceremony, no acknowledgement beyond annoyance at having to find a replacement. Working in the shop also exposed Valdane to the Ork approach to problem solving, which could charitably be described as direct. If something didn't fit, you hit it until it did. If a machine didn't work, you added more pieces until it did, or until it exploded, at which point you built something else. If a slave wasn't performing adequately, you beat them or replaced them. There was no analysis, no troubleshooting in any systematic sense, just action and reaction, trial and error on the most basic level. Yet for all the chaos, for all the apparent randomness, there was a kind of logic at work. The Orks valued things that were loud, things that were big, things that were fast, and things that were violent. A weapon that killed effectively was good. A weapon that killed effectively while being very loud and producing impressive explosions was better. Efficiency in the human sense Minimal resource expenditure for maximum output was not a consideration. The Orks had access to effectively limitless salvage and slaves. Why would they care about efficiency? Valdane also witnessed the relationship between the mech boys and other Ork specialists. The Pain Boys, whom he'd heard about but hoped never to encounter directly, sometimes visited the workshops to commission bionics, crude cybernetic replacements for injured Orks. These transactions were fascinating in their brutality. The Pain Boy would describe what it needed, often with reference to an Ork it had recently operated on. The mech boy would nod and begin assembling something that looked more like a torture device than a prosthetic. Yet, when attached to an Ork, these crude bionics functioned, allowing the recipient to continue fighting. The Ork regenerative abilities helped, certainly, but there was also that underlying psychic field, making the impossible simply improbable. The Pain Boys. When medicine becomes horror, Valdane's encounter with the Pain Boys came inevitably. In the workshops, injuries were common. A piece of metal would slip, a tool would malfunction, a slave would simply be in the wrong place at the wrong time. Most injuries were ignored unless they prevented work. But when Valdane's hand was crushed under a falling piece of machinery, the damage was severe enough that he could no longer perform his duties. The Gretchen overseers, faced with a useless slave, made a decision that Valdane would later wish had gone differently. They sent him to the Pain Boy. The medical area of the Ork encampment was located in what had once been a human hospital. The irony was not lost on Valdane as he was dragged, hand throbbing with agony, into a building that should have represented healing but now housed something far different. The walls were still visible in places, though most surfaces were covered with grime and biological matter that Valdane tried not to examine too closely. The smell was overwhelming. Blood, chemicals, and the sickly sweet odor of infection and rot. The Pain Boy that ran this charnel house was named Grotznik, and it embodied everything terrifying about Ork medicine. It stood perhaps 8 feet tall, its apron, if the stained and crusted garment could be called that, covered in fluids of various colors. Its tools, spread across multiple crude tables, ranged from recognizable surgical implements to devices that looked more like torture equipment. And its eyes, when they fell on Valdane, held a gleeful enthusiasm that promised suffering. Ork Pain Boys, Valdane had learned from whispered conversations with other slaves, were born with an instinctive understanding of anatomy and surgery. Like the mech boys and their machines, Pain Boys simply knew things about bodies that other creatures had to learn. But their knowledge was fundamentally different from human medical understanding. They knew how to take an Ork apart and put it back together. They knew how to attach crude cybernetics. They knew how to perform transplants and augmentations. What they didn't know or didn't care about was reducing suffering or improving patient outcomes beyond the bare minimum of survival. Grotznik grabbed Valdane's injured hand with surprising gentleness, examining it with what seemed like professional interest. It poked at the crushed bones, making Valdane scream, and grunted something that might have been satisfaction. Then it turned to its table of tools and selected what appeared to be a saw. Valdane's protests were useless. He was held down by Gretchen assistants while the Pain Boy prepared to work. The operation, if it could be called that, was conducted without anesthetic. The Pain Boys understood that Orks could tolerate immense pain, and they approached human patients with the same assumption. Grotznik sawed through Valdane's wrist with businesslike efficiency, tossing the removed hand into a bucket without ceremony. The pain was indescribable. Valdane screamed until his voice gave out, then continued screaming silently as the Pain Boy worked. But amputation was not the end of the procedure. Grotznik, with an enthusiasm that suggested this was the fun part, selected a bionic from a collection of crude prosthetics. The device was a monstrosity of metal and wiring, far too large for a human arm, clearly designed for an Ork. The Pain Boy seemed to recognize this problem and set about modifying the bionic with the same casual approach it applied to the surgery. It cut pieces off with a hacksaw, welded bits together, and eventually produce something that might, generously, be called arm-shaped. Attaching the bionic involved more surgery, more pain, and the liberal application of what appeared to be some kind of adhesive and staples. Throughout the process, Groznyk chattered in its guttural language, occasionally making sounds that might have been laughter. The Gretchen assistants scurried about, fetching tools and supplies, seemingly unconcerned with Valdane's agony. The whole procedure took perhaps an hour, though to Valdane it felt like days. When it was over, Valdane had a new arm. It was ugly, crude, and hurt constantly. But it moved when he willed it to move, and the hand portion could grasp things, albeit clumsily. Groznyk seemed pleased with its work, nodding and making approving sounds. It even gave Valdane something to drink. A foul-tasting liquid that might have been some kind of pain reliever, or might have been engine coolant. Whatever it was, it dulled the worst of the agony and allowed Valdane to stumble out of the medical area under his own power. The bionic changed Valdane's status among the other slaves. Some viewed it with horror, seeing in his augmentation a disturbing fusion of human and orc technology. Others saw it as evidence that he was tougher than he looked, having survived the Pain Boy's ministrations. And the orcs? They barely noticed. To them, the bionic was just a practical solution to a mechanical problem. A worker had been damaged and was now repaired. That was all there was to it. But for Valdane, the bionic was a constant reminder of how far he had fallen. His new arm worked after a fashion, but it was uncomfortable, prone to malfunction, and made him feel like a grotesque hybrid of human and machine. He found himself touching it in quiet moments, trying to reconcile this crude prosthetic with the person he used to be. The rings he had worn on his original hand were gone, of course. Everything from his old life was gone, and now even his body was being replaced, piece by piece, with orc technology. The entertainment of suffering, spectacle in orc society. Not all captives labored in workshops or scrapyards. Some served different purposes, and Valdane learned about these other roles through observation and through stories shared in the quiet moments when the slaves had some small measure of freedom from supervision. The orcs, for all their focus on combat and construction, also enjoyed entertainment. Their idea of entertainment, however, was characteristically brutal. Gladiatorial combat was common, with slaves forced to fight each other or sometimes against Gretchen or even young orcs for the amusement of the greenskins. These fights were conducted in crude arenas, usually just cleared spaces surrounded by gathered orcs, who bet teeth on the outcomes and shouted encouragement or derision as the mood struck them. Valdane witnessed one of these events when his work group was allowed a brief respite and the orcs decided to stage some impromptu entertainment. A space was cleared and several slaves were dragged into the center. They were given crude weapons, clubs, knives, broken pieces of metal, and told to fight. The implication was clear. The winners would receive better food and treatment. The losers would receive nothing at all, being dead or too injured to care about rewards. The fights were horrific to watch. These were not trained warriors. They were merchants, bureaucrats, workers, people who had never held weapons in their lives. They swung clumsily, defended poorly, and died messily. The orcs loved it. They roared with laughter when someone slipped in the blood, slicking the ground. They cheered when a particularly brutal blow landed. They threw scraps of food to favorites and jeered at those who fought poorly. One of the combatants was a former noble Valdane had spoken with occasionally, a man named Drusus, who had controlled mining interests before the invasion. Drusus was forced to fight a former worker from his own mines, a cruel irony that the orcs probably didn't even notice, but which devastated both men. The fight was brief. Drusus won. If killing someone who could barely defend themselves could be called winning. But the cost of that victory was written on his face when he stumbled out of the arena. He had killed a man he knew, had violated every principle he thought he held, all to survive a few more days in this hell. Other forms of entertainment were less directly violent but no less degrading. The Orks sometimes forced slaves to perform tasks that were deliberately impossible, then beat them when they failed. They might order a human to lift something far too heavy, then laugh as the person strained and ultimately collapsed. They might demand that a slave run increasingly faster around a circuit until exhaustion caused them to fall, at which point the Orks would simply find a new slave to torment. There was no point to these exercises beyond amusement. The suffering was the point. Some pain boys used captives for experimentation. These Orks were genuinely curious about how non-Ork bodies worked and approached this curiosity with the same brutal directness they applied to everything else. Valdane heard stories of slaves subjected to procedures that would make even hardened Imperial medici physically ill. Transplants of Ork organs into human bodies, just to see what would happen. Toxin testing. Bionic augmentation taken to extremes that left the subject more machine than flesh. And always, the work was done without anesthetic, without concern for the patient's comfort or dignity. There were also the squigs. These creatures, part of the Orkoid ecosystem, came in many varieties. Some were kept as food animals. Others served specific purposes like producing oil or other substances the Orks needed, and some were kept purely because the Orks found them entertaining. The face biters, for instance, were little more than ambulatory mouths on stubby legs, but Ork knobs and war bosses kept them as status symbols and attack animals. Feeding time for these creatures was another source of Ork entertainment, and sometimes the food was human. Valdane watched from a safe distance as a group of slaves who had displeased their overseers were thrown into a pen with several face-biter squigs. The screams didn't last long. The creatures were voracious and efficient. The Orks, watching, placed bets on which squig would claim the most kills and laughed at the spectacle. For them, this was just another day. For Valdane and the other slaves watching, it was a reminder of their ultimate dispensability. They were food, entertainment, tools, nothing more. The hierarchy of suffering, how former wealth makes things worse. As the weeks turned to months, Valdane began to notice patterns in how different captives were treated. The Orks, for all their lack of understanding of human social hierarchies, were not completely oblivious to differences between individual slaves. They just measured those differences in ways that had nothing to do with former status or wealth. Physical size mattered. Larger humans could carry more weight and perform heavier labor, so they were valued more highly for certain tasks. But they also required more food, which made them more expensive to maintain. Intelligence, if it manifested in useful ways like technical knowledge or language skills, could be valuable. Slaves who could understand some of the Ork language and serve as intermediaries with other captives were more useful than those who couldn't communicate. Fighting ability mattered for the arena slaves and those used in combat training exercises. But former wealth, former status, these things were not just irrelevant, they were actively detrimental. The Gretchen, who themselves occupied the lowest rungs of Ork society, seemed to take particular pleasure in humiliating those who had clearly been important. If your hands were soft and uncalloused when you arrived, marking you as someone who had never done manual labor, the Gretchen would assign you the heaviest, most brutal work. If you wore the remnants of fine clothes, even if they were now rags, you would be singled out for extra punishment when quotas weren't met. Valdane experienced this firsthand. His initial attempts to maintain some dignity, to speak with authority, to carry himself as he had before, all of this marked him as a target. The Gretchen overseers would watch for him specifically, would find fault with his work even when he performed adequately, would strike him for infractions real and imagined. It took time for him to learn that survival required erasure, becoming as anonymous and unremarkable as possible. Other former elites learned this lesson at different rates and with varying degrees of success. Some, like the priest Domitian, adapted by finding new roles that gave them purpose and value without drawing negative attention. Domitian became a counselor and mediator among the slaves. helping to resolve disputes and maintain morale. The Orks didn't care about this role, and the slaves benefited from it, so it was allowed to continue. Others never adapted. Valdane watched as a former planetary governor, a man who had ruled millions, continued to demand special treatment, continued to insist on his importance, continued to expect rescue and redemption. The Orks eventually tired of his demands and gave him to a pain boy who was looking for subjects to test a new procedure. The man didn't survive the week. His final days were spent in agony, his augmented body failing as the crude Ork bionics rejected the human flesh they'd been grafted to. There was a particular cruelty in what happened to the wealthy. They had fallen further than most. A common worker enslaved by Orks experienced horror and hardship, certainly, but they had already known labor, had already understood physical suffering to some degree. For people like Valdane, people who had never experienced real deprivation, the shock was more profound. They had to unlearn everything their lives had taught them about value and status and purpose. They had to accept that all their accomplishments, all their wealth, all their careful cultivation of position and influence meant absolutely nothing. The psychological impact was devastating. Valdane saw former nobles reduced to gibbering wrecks, their minds simply unable to process the totality of their fall. He saw wealthy merchants become so obsessed with their lost fortunes that they neglected survival, dying from simple malnutrition or preventable injuries because they couldn't accept their new reality. He saw military officers whose entire identity had been built around command and hierarchy collapse when forced to take orders from creatures they would have considered beneath notice in their former lives. Some captives coped by creating elaborate fantasies. They convinced themselves that this was temporary, that rescue was imminent, that their wealth and status would somehow reassert itself. These delusions provided comfort, but ultimately made adaptation harder. Reality would intrude eventually, through a beating that drove home their powerlessness, through the death of a companion that highlighted their mortality, through simple exhaustion and starvation that made fantasy impossible to maintain. Others found ways to use their former skills and knowledge to survive. A merchant who understood negotiation and trade might broker deals between slaves, trading labor or resources. A bureaucrat who understood organization might help coordinate work details to improve efficiency and reduce the burden on everyone. A physician or tech priest might offer what medical care they could with limited resources. These adaptations didn't change the fundamental horror of their situation, but they provided purpose and increased chances of survival. Valdane himself found his niche through his work in the mech boy shop. His ability to understand instructions and anticipate needs made him more valuable than slaves who simply followed orders without comprehension. Scragdaka actually seemed to prefer having Valdane assist, rather than some of the other slaves who cycled through the workshop. This preference didn't translate to better treatment in any absolute sense, but it meant Valdane was beaten less frequently and had somewhat more reliable access to food. In the economy of suffering that defined slave life, these were significant advantages. The breaking point. When humanity erodes, there came a point, different for each captive, when the person they had been simply ceased to exist. For some, this breaking point came early, a sudden and complete psychological collapse. For others, it was a gradual erosion, a slow wearing away of identity and personality, until little remained but the animal drive to survive. For Valdane, the breaking point came approximately 6 months into his captivity, though he had lost precise track of time by then. It began with the arrival of new captives from a raid on another world. Among them was someone Valdane recognized, Justinia Marek, a business rival from his former life. She had competed with his trading house for lucrative contracts. Their rivalry had been intense, conducted in boardrooms and through political machinations. He had considered her an enemy, someone to be defeated in the complex game of commerce and influence. Now she stood in the slave pens, beaten and terrified, wearing rags and sporting the fresh brand that marked her as Ork property. And Valdane felt nothing, not satisfaction at her fall, not sympathy for her suffering, not even recognition of their shared former world. She was just another slave, another anonymous body in the mass of human misery. Her presence didn't matter. Her past didn't matter. Nothing about her was relevant to his survival. This realization horrified him more than any of the physical torments he'd endured. Something fundamental had changed inside him. The person who would have cared about Justinia Marek, who would have defined himself in opposition to her, who would have measured his success against hers, that person was gone. What remained was a creature focused entirely on immediate concerns, getting food, avoiding beatings, performing work adequately enough to be useful, but not so well as to draw extra attention. He tried to force himself to care, to feel something about this development. But the emotional capacity wasn't there anymore. It had been worn away by months of brutality and deprivation. The Orks hadn't set out to destroy his personality. They had simply created conditions where maintaining it was impossible. Every day was about survival. There was no room for the luxury of identity beyond what was needed to navigate the immediate environment. Other long-term captives showed similar erosion. Their conversations, when they had energy for conversation, focused entirely on the present. Food, work assignments, which Orks to avoid, which Gretchen overseers were most likely to beat you, and which might show some minimal restraint. The past, their former lives, the people they had been, these topics rarely came up anymore. They were irrelevant, even painful to consider. Valdane noticed he had stopped thinking of himself by his name. He was just the one who works in Skragdaka's shop, or the human with the bionic arm. His identity had reduced to his utility and distinguishing features. When new slaves arrived and tried to organize resistance or plan escape, he didn't participate. Not because he had abandoned hope. Hope wasn't even a concept he engaged with anymore, but because such plans required a level of future thinking and emotional investment that he no longer possessed. The breaking of personality showed in physical ways too. Slaves who had been captive for extended periods moved differently than new arrivals. They had a kind of shuffling walk, eyes down, shoulders hunched, designed to minimize their presence. They responded to Ork commands instantly, without the hesitation or protest that newer captives sometimes showed. They had learned at a deep, instinctive level what was required to survive, and they performed those requirements automatically. Speech patterns changed. The complex language of their former lives simplified to the bare minimum needed for communication. Valdane found himself thinking in simpler terms, using shorter sentences, reducing everything to basic functions and immediate concerns. The part of his mind that had once engaged in complex trade negotiations and political maneuvering had simply stopped functioning. It wasn't needed. It had no application to his current existence. Some captives resisted this erosion more effectively than others. Father Domitian maintained his faith and his sense of purpose through ministering to others. The former officer Kyrios found meaning in trying to protect weaker slaves and maintain some organization among the human captives. But even they showed signs of fundamental change. Their efforts had a desperate quality, as if they knew they were fighting a losing battle against their own dissolution and were determined to resist for as long as possible. Valdane sometimes wondered if death would have been preferable to this living erosion of self. But even that thought was abstract, disconnected from real emotion. He didn't feel despair about his situation. He didn't feel much of anything. He simply existed, day after day, performing the tasks required of him, surviving because the alternative required more effort than continuing. The rare exceptions, when utility creates value. Not all captives experience the same fate. Valdane began to notice that certain slaves received noticeably better treatment, and the reasons for this gradually became clear. The Orks, for all their brutality, were fundamentally pragmatic. If a slave proved exceptionally useful, they might be treated less harshly, given better rations, even afforded a degree of respect that other captives could never achieve. There was a woman named Katerina, who had been a military engineer before her capture. Her knowledge of fortifications and defensive structures caught the attention of a big mech, one of the most skilled and important mech boys in the warband. The big mech recognized that Katerina understood things about construction and structural integrity that even its instinctive knowledge didn't cover. She became something approaching a valued consultant. Her opinions actually solicited when the big mech was planning particularly ambitious projects. This didn't make Katerina free exactly, but it did mean she was fed better, housed separately from the general slave population, and protected from casual violence. The big mech had invested significant effort in teaching her enough of the Ork language to communicate complex technical concepts. Other Orks learned not to interfere with her because she was useful to someone important. In the brutal hierarchy of Ork society, this protection mattered. There were translators and interpreters, slaves who had learned to speak the Ork language fluently and could bridge the communication gap between the greenskins and their captives. These individuals were valuable because they made managing large slave populations more efficient. They could translate orders, explain requirements, and help prevent the kind of misunderstandings that led to slaves being killed for not comprehending what was demanded of them. Medical knowledge, even human medical knowledge, could sometimes be valuable. The pain boys were curious about differences between Ork and human physiology. A slave with medical training might be kept around to explain things, to assist with procedures on human captives, or simply to satisfy a pain boy's intellectual curiosity. These slaves still suffered, certainly. Working for a pain boy was its own particular horror, but they had a degree of security that pure laborers lacked. Combat ability could elevate a slave's status. Those who performed well in the arena fights sometimes attracted the attention of Orks who valued good scrappers. These slaves might be given better weapons, better training, and better care because they provided entertainment and could potentially be useful in actual combat. Some even achieved a kind of Stockholm Syndrome relationship with their Ork patrons, internalizing the greenskin values and fighting fiercely to prove their worth. But these exceptions were rare, and the improvements in treatment they represented were relative. A valued slave was still a slave. They could still be beaten, still be killed, still be treated as property. The difference was that their particular form of captivity was marginally less brutal than the norm. They had moved from being disposable tools to being slightly less disposable tools. This was an improvement only in comparison to the absolute bottom of human suffering. Valdane sometimes fantasized about becoming one of these valued slaves. If he could learn more about Ork technology, become indispensable to Skragdaka, perhaps his lot would improve. But the effort required seemed beyond him. He was just trying to survive each day. The idea of investing extra effort to increase his value felt impossible when all his energy went to basic existence. He did notice that his bionic arm gave him a certain status among some Orks. They saw the crude prosthetic as evidence that he'd survived a pain boy's work, which suggested toughness, even if that toughness was only a product of Ork physiology being more resilient than human biology. This didn't translate to better treatment, exactly, but Orks sometimes acknowledged his existence where they would ignore other slaves. It was a small thing, but in the economy of suffering, small things mattered. The cost of long-term captivity, body and mind. As seasons changed and time continued its relentless march, the long-term effects of captivity became increasingly apparent. Valdane was no longer the person who had been captured. That person was dead, metaphorically at first, and eventually in every meaningful sense. What remained was something else, something shaped entirely by the brutal environment in which it existed. Physically, he was unrecognizable. The soft, well-fed merchant had been replaced by a lean, scarred creature whose body was a map of suffering. The bionic arm was just the most obvious modification. He bore brands from multiple punishments, scars from injuries that had healed poorly or not at all, and the permanent stoop of someone who had done too much heavy labor with inadequate nutrition. His original teeth, which the Orks had no interest in, had largely fallen out from malnutrition and poor care. His vision had deteriorated from working in poorly lit conditions and from simple stress. His hair, prematurely grey, had thinned to the point of near baldness. If someone from his former life could have seen him, they wouldn't have recognized the person they once knew. Mentally, the changes were even more profound. Memory itself had become unreliable. Valdane could no longer clearly recall his life before captivity. Faces of family members were gone. Details of his work were lost. Even his own name sometimes felt unfamiliar, like a word he'd heard but didn't quite understand. The human mind isn't designed to function under constant stress and deprivation. It adapts, but the adaptations come at a cost. His was the cost of everything that made him who he had been. Other long-term captives showed similar degradation. There were slaves who could no longer speak coherently, their language centers damaged by trauma and neglect. There were those who had developed repetitive behaviors, rocking or muttering, or performing the same small gesture over and over, comfort mechanisms that helped them process the unprocessable. There were those who had simply withdrawn completely, their eyes vacant, responding to commands but showing no spark of consciousness beyond basic stimulus response. Disease was constant, with poor sanitation, inadequate nutrition, and overcrowded living conditions. Illness spread rapidly through the slave population. The Orks didn't care unless disease reduced productivity significantly. Then they might separate the obviously sick from the healthy, not out of compassion, but out of the same logic that made them separate, spoiled food from good food. The sick were often simply killed and disposed of to prevent further contamination of the labor force. Valdane had survived several outbreaks through a combination of luck and the crude resilience his body had developed, but each bout of illness left him weaker, more damaged. He could feel himself deteriorating, could sense that there would come a point where his body simply couldn't continue. The Orks wouldn't care. They would dispose of him and replace him with a fresh slave from the next raid. That was how it worked. That was how it had always worked. There were no old slaves. This was a realization that came to Valdane as he observed the population in the camps. The longest-term captives, people who had been enslaved for a year or more, were still relatively young. Where were the elderly? Where were those who had been captive for years? The answer was obvious once you thought about it. They had died. The conditions didn't permit long-term survival. People wore out, broke down, succumbed to injury or disease or simple exhaustion. The turnover rate was probably high, though the Orks didn't track such things. This realization should have filled him with despair, but Valdane found he didn't have the emotional capacity for despair anymore. It was just another fact about his environment, like the fact that water came from troughs or that Gretchen carried shock prods. He would die here, probably soon, given how he was deteriorating. This was simply the truth of his existence now. The broader context, why wealth never mattered. Looking at his situation from whatever analytical capacity remained, Valdane could finally understand why his former wealth and status had been so completely irrelevant from the moment of capture. The Ork worldview was so fundamentally different from human civilization that the two barely overlapped. Humans built hierarchies based on abstract concepts: money, titles, education, connections. These things had no physical existence, but derived their power from collective agreement. Everyone in human society agreed that certain pieces of metal were valuable, that certain positions commanded respect, that certain achievements marked someone as important. This agreement created reality, social reality certainly, but reality nonetheless. Orks had no such collective agreement about human concepts. Their hierarchy was based on physical characteristics that were immediately apparent: size, strength, ability to inflict violence. A big orc was important because he could beat up smaller orcs. A nob held status because he could enforce his will through physical power. A war boss commanded because he was the biggest and meanest greenskin around. And anyone who disagreed could challenge him and would probably die for the attempt. Into this system came Valdane, bearing symbols of wealth that represented agreed-upon value in human society, but had no physical reality. His rings were just small pieces of metal. His fine clothes were just cloth. His titles were sounds that conveyed no meaning to orc ears. He was smaller than almost any orc, weaker than the smallest Gretchen, unable to enforce his will on anyone. By every metric the orcs used to measure value, he was worthless. This wasn't a moral judgment. The orcs weren't punishing him for his wealth or his status. They simply didn't recognize these things as real. It would be like trying to pay for something with currency from a dream. The money might seem real and valuable in the dream context, but in waking life, it has no substance, no purchasing power, no meaning at all. The tragedy was that Valdane had spent his entire life accumulating something that could evaporate instantly when the context changed. Wealth in human society was powerful because everyone participated in the same system of value. Remove that system, expose the wealth to a completely different set of values, and it revealed itself as pure abstraction with no independent reality. This was why the wealthy fell so much harder than the poor when the orcs came. A worker who relied on their physical labor for survival had a skill that retained value even in captivity. Their identity wasn't built on abstractions, but on their ability to do things. A merchant, whose entire identity was built on accumulating currency and status, had nothing once those concepts became meaningless. They had to start from nothing. And that transition was psychologically devastating. It was also why the orcs never developed anything like the slavery systems of the Dark Eldar, or even the historical slavery of human civilizations. Those systems recognized slaves as having value beyond immediate utility, value that could be traded, value that required preservation. The orcs viewed slaves as simply another resource, like ammunition or fuel. Use it until it's gone, then get more. The idea of investing in slaves, of preserving them, of creating systems to maximize their long-term utility, these required a level of abstract thinking and future planning that didn't really exist in orc society. Orc society ran on immediate concerns. Are you hungry? Eat something. Need teeth? Punch another orc and take his. Want a better gun? Get a mech boy to build you one. Everything was direct, physical, immediate. The complex systems of value and exchange that characterized human civilization were absent, replaced by a brutal simplicity that worked for the orcs because their biology and psychic field supported it. The end. When suffering becomes permanent. Valdane's story, like that of all slaves who don't achieve the rare status of valued specialists, moved toward an inevitable conclusion. His body, already damaged and weakened, began to fail more rapidly as his second year of captivity approached. The work that had once been difficult but manageable became agonizing. Lifting materials that he had struggled with now proved impossible. Even operating his bionic arm, which had become second nature, required concentration he often couldn't muster. The Gretchen overseers noticed his declining productivity. They beat him more frequently, hoping to restore his performance through pain, but there's a limit to what beatings can accomplish. A body that's failing from malnutrition and accumulated damage won't work better because it's been struck. It will simply fail faster. Valdane knew what happened to slaves who could no longer work. He'd seen it countless times. They were removed from the labor details and either killed outright or given to the pain boys for experimentation. There was no retirement, no nursing care, no acknowledgement of past service, just disposal and replacement. He had perhaps weeks before his utility dropped below the threshold that would trigger his removal. Father Domitian, still somehow maintaining his faith and his role as spiritual counselor, spoke with Valdane during one of the brief rest periods. The priest had aged dramatically during their shared captivity, his face lined with suffering and his body bent, but his eyes still held some spark of the person he had been. "Do you pray?" Domitian asked. Valdane considered the question. Did he pray? Had he ever truly prayed, even in his former life, when religion was a social obligation rather than a genuine faith? "I don't know what I would pray for," he finally said. "Death seems like mercy, but I'm too tired to want it. Rescue is impossible. Better treatment won't come. What's left to pray for?" "To remain human," Domitian said. "To retain some fragment of the soul even in this hell. That's what I pray for all of us." But Valdane wasn't sure he was human anymore, in any meaningful sense. The person he had been was gone. What remained was a damaged animal that performed labor when capable and would be destroyed when it no longer could. If there was a soul in that, he couldn't find it. The end came not with drama, but with simple exhaustion. Valdane was hauling a load of scrap when his legs simply stopped working. He fell, the material scattering around him, with a crash that barely registered over the constant noise of the workshop. He tried to rise and couldn't. His muscles, pushed beyond any reasonable limit for months, simply refused to respond. His body had reached its limit and was shutting down, cell by cell, system by system, like a machine running out of fuel. The Gretchen overseers came quickly, their shock sticks crackling with malicious energy. They prodded him repeatedly, the electricity coursing through his damaged nervous system and bringing waves of agony. But the pain, as terrible as it was, couldn't force movement from muscles that had nothing left to give. The electricity just illuminated his failure, making it clear to everyone watching that this particular tool had finally, completely broken. He was done, finished, used up. Other workers stepped around him without pause. There was no room for sympathy in the camps, no energy to spare for mourning those who fell. Everyone knew that any one of them could be next, stopping to help, showing concern, drawing attention to another's weakness. These things only made you a target, so they worked around Valdane's collapsed form, as if he were just another piece of debris in the workshop, which, in a sense, he had become. The Gretchen conferred in their high-pitched voices, gesturing at Valdane with evident frustration. He represented an inconvenience, a disruption to workflow that would need to be addressed. Finally, they grabbed his arms and dragged him from the workshop. His bionic arm scraped against the ground, sending sparks flying as metal ground against stone. He felt it distantly, the pain adding to the general symphony of suffering that had become his constant companion. They dragged him through the camp, past work details and weapon emplacements, and all the organized chaos of Ork society in motion. Other slaves glanced at him and looked away quickly. They knew what being dragged away meant. They knew where he was going, and they knew that any of them might take this same journey at any moment. The sight of Valdane's removal was just another reminder of their own mortality. Another confirmation that the camps ground through human lives like meat through a grinder. The disposal area was a section of the camp that Valdane had heard about but never seen. It was located on the periphery, downwind from the main living areas, even by Ork standards of what constituted livable space. The smell reached him before they arrived. Rot and chemicals and burning flesh, a combination so foul it triggered a gag reflex even in his diminished state. The Gretchen dumped him without ceremony into a large open area where broken tools and unusable materials were collected before being taken to the melting furnaces. Other slaves lay there, scattered among the mechanical debris like discarded dolls. Some were still alive but too injured or ill to work. Some were unconscious, their breathing shallow and irregular. Some had clearly been dead for hours or even days, their bodies beginning to decompose in the heat and filth. The Orks would sort through this area periodically, deciding what could be salvaged and what should be destroyed. The sorting process was casual, almost lazy, as if the Orks found the task tedious but necessary. Slaves that were obviously dying went to the incinerators. Those that might be interesting subjects for painboy experimentation went to the medical area. Those that might be repaired and returned to service were treated with whatever crude medical interventions the Gretchen deemed sufficient. The criteria for these decisions were opaque to human understanding, seemingly arbitrary or based on whims that changed from moment to moment. The distinction didn't much matter to the victims. Whether you were burned, experimented on, or put back to work, the outcome was more suffering. Death was the only real escape, and even that was not granted quickly or mercifully. As Valdane lay among the broken things, waiting for whatever end the Orks decided for him, he found himself thinking about wealth, not his lost fortune. That seemed like something from a dream, unreal and distant, but about the concept of wealth itself. He had spent his life accumulating it, building it, measuring himself by it, and in the end, it had meant nothing, less than nothing. It had been a shared delusion, powerful only because everyone agreed to believe in it. The real wealth, he realized too late, would have been the kind of strength, knowledge, or skill that had independent value. Things that didn't require social agreement to matter. Things that would have helped him survive this hell instead of making his fall worse. But he had never developed such things. Why would he have? In the world he came from, abstract wealth was enough. A pain boy eventually came, examining the various bodies in the disposal area. It looked at Valdane with clinical interest, noting the bionic arm, the brands, the visible deterioration. It consulted with another Ork in their guttural language. Valdane couldn't understand the words, but he understood the gesture. He was being selected for something. They dragged him to the medical area, and he recognized Grotznik, the same pain boy that had attached his bionic arm. The creature seemed pleased to see him, in its own alien way, as if recognizing a previous patient. It made sounds that might have been enthusiasm, or might have been the Ork equivalent of scientific interest. Valdane was too weak to care which. The last thing he experienced as anything resembling Coordinator Hieronymus Valdane was the sight of Grotznik's tools being laid out. Saws, drills, instruments he couldn't name. Then the pain began, and what remained of his consciousness fled into darkness, never to return. His body survived the procedures, after a fashion. Grotznik was testing new bionic configurations and needed subjects. What emerged from that medical area days later looked vaguely human in shape, but was more machine than flesh. It could follow simple commands. It could perform basic labor. But whatever spark of consciousness that had once been a wealthy merchant named Valdane was gone, erased by trauma and mechanical augmentation. This shell of a person worked in the labor camps for another few months before finally breaking down completely. The Orks, faced with a machine hybrid that no longer functioned, simply disposed of it in the furnaces. The teeth value of the materials recovered barely paid for the fuel to melt them down. This was the final accounting of a life that had once been measured in millions, a handful of recycled metal and a moment of heat. The fate of others, variations on horror. Valdane's story, while specific in its details, represents a pattern repeated countless times across the galaxy, wherever Orks conquer human populations. The specifics vary, but certain elements remain constant. The complete irrelevance of former status, the brutal pragmatism of Ork slavery, the gradual erosion of identity and personality, and the inevitable end. The dissolution of time, when days become endless. One of the most profound psychological effects of Ork captivity, particularly for the wealthy who had lived structured lives governed by schedules and appointments, was the complete dissolution of normal time perception. In Valdane's former life, time had been carefully managed and measured. Meetings at specific hours, deadlines for contracts, seasonal planning for trade routes. His days had been organized down to the minute, each moment accounted for and assigned purpose. In the camps, time became something else entirely. The Orks had no interest in human concepts of schedules or regular hours. Work began when the sun rose or when the Orks decided it should begin, whichever came first. It ended when darkness made labor impossible, or when the overseers grew bored, whichever came later. Some days lasted what felt like endless ages, the sun crawling across the sky with agonizing slowness, while muscles screamed and exhaustion mounted. Other days seemed to pass in a blur, the work so consuming that awareness of anything beyond the immediate task simply ceased. The lack of calendars or regular markers of time passing created a disorienting timelessness. Valdane lost track of weeks, then months. Was it summer or winter? He couldn't be certain. The weather changed, certainly, but without the cultural framework that divided the year into named segments, the seasons lost meaning. It was hot, or it was cold, or it was raining. That was the extent of temporal awareness that mattered. This timelessness was, in its own way, a form of torture. Humans organize their lives around time's passage. We plan for the future, we commemorate the past, we mark milestones and celebrate anniversaries. Without the ability to track time reliably, without knowing how long one had been captive or how long one might remain so, a fundamental human capacity was stripped away. Valdane sometimes tried to count days, marking them in his memory, but the count would slip away during periods of illness or particularly brutal work. He would lose track and have to start over, and eventually he stopped trying altogether. Other captives attempted various methods of tracking time. Some tried to mark days by scratching lines on walls or collecting small stones, one for each day survived. But the Orks would periodically move slaves between different areas of the camp, separating them from their crude calendars. And during periods of intense work or crisis, maintaining the count became impossible. The rhythm of labor was too consuming to permit even such simple record-keeping. The wealthy captives seemed to suffer more from this temporal dissolution than those who had been workers or laborers. Perhaps because their former lives had been so rigidly scheduled, so carefully organized around time's progression, they felt its absence more keenly. A merchant who had lived by trade schedules and delivery deadlines found the shapeless days almost maddening. A bureaucrat, whose entire career had been built on processing documents by specified dates, could barely function without that temporal framework. Valdane noticed this in himself. In the early days of captivity, he had tried to maintain some sense of passing time, thinking that rescue would come and he would need to account for his absence. He had imagined explaining to colleagues or family how long he had been gone, what he had endured, how he had survived. But as weeks became months, became an indeterminate span of suffering, that impulse faded. What did it matter if he had been captive for 2 months or 6? The number changed nothing about his situation. The seasons did mark some changes, though they came and went without names or celebration. Winter brought cold that the Orks barely seemed to notice, but which killed weaker slaves by the dozens. The crude shelters provided no real protection from the elements. Slaves huddled together for warmth, sharing body heat in desperate attempts to survive the nights. Some mornings, the living would wake to find that some of those they had slept pressed against had died in the night, their bodies cold and stiff. Summer brought different horrors. The heat combined with poor sanitation to create breeding grounds for disease. Dysentery swept through the camps regularly, weakening slaves already on the edge of physical collapse. Water became scarce and had to be rationed, with the Orks taking first priority and slaves getting whatever remained. Dehydration killed as surely as cold, and the bodies piled up in the disposal areas, waiting for processing that came whenever the Orks got around to it. There were no holidays, no festivals, no markers of cultural significance. Religious days passed unobserved, except by a few, like Father Domitian, who maintained their faith through sheer will. But even these observances were hollow things, prayers muttered quickly in the darkness, services held in whispers lest they attract unwanted attention. The Orks didn't care if slaves prayed, but they also didn't care if slaves were beaten for gathering, and the Gretchen sometimes broke up groups for no reason beyond their own amusement. Birthdays ceased to have meaning. Valdane didn't know when his had passed in the first year of captivity. Had he turned a year older? Probably. But the occasion went unmarked, unnoticed, as meaningless as any other day. He had been raised in a culture where birthdays were celebrated, where the passage of another year of life was acknowledged and honored. Now the concept seemed absurd. Why celebrate another year of life when each additional day was just more suffering? The wealthy had often marked time through possessions, through acquisitions and accumulations. A watch purchased in a particular year, a piece of art acquired to commemorate an achievement. These objects served as external markers of time's passage, anchors in the flow of years. But in the camps, there were no possessions, no accumulations. Every slave owned nothing beyond their degraded body and whatever rags they wore. Without these external markers, time became even more fluid and difficult to grasp. Some captives created internal markers instead, significant events that divided their captivity into before and after. Before the first arena fight, after the outbreak of plague, before the pain boy took their limb, after the particularly brutal winter. These personal demarcations provided some structure, some way of organizing memory and experience. But they were private things, not shared or standardized. Each captive's temporal landscape was unique, defined by their own trauma and survival. Valdane's markers included the attachment of his bionic arm, which divided his captivity into the time when he was whole and the time when he was augmented. The arrival of Justinia Marek, when he realized his capacity for caring had eroded completely. The death of his work group's original overseer and its replacement by a crueler Runthard. These events stood out in the otherwise undifferentiated flow of suffering, islands of specific memory in an ocean of vague, blurred recollection. The dissolution of time perception was, in some ways, a mercy. If captives had maintained accurate awareness of how long they had been enslaved, the despair might have been unbearable. Not knowing if it had been 6 months or a year or longer allowed for a kind of protective vagueness. The mind couldn't calculate odds of rescue if it couldn't accurately assess how much time had passed. It couldn't despair about years lost if years couldn't be counted. Justinia Marek, the rival merchant who had arrived in a later wave of captives, lasted less time than Valdane. She never adapted to the physical demands of slavery. Her body, even more softened by luxury than Valdane's had been, broke down rapidly under the harsh conditions. She died from a combination of malnutrition and disease within 4 months of capture, her body disposed of without ceremony. Kyrios, the former military officer, survived longer through a combination of physical fitness and mental fortitude. He maintained his efforts to protect weaker slaves and organize some resistance to the worst abuses. This ultimately led to his selection for the arena fights, where his combat skills made him a favorite. He won 17 fights before facing an opponent who was simply better. His death was quick, at least, and the Orks cheered his final performance. Malika, the merchant who had dealt in fine fabrics, found unexpected utility in her knowledge of textiles. An Ork who had looted an enormous amount of cloth but didn't know what to do with it conscripted her to create banners and decorations. Her status as a valued specialist gave her better conditions than most slaves, though she still bore scars and brands and the psychological damage of captivity. She was alive last anyone knew, though alive was perhaps too strong a word for what she had become. Father Domitian continued his ministry among the slaves until disease claimed him. He died from an infection that proper medical care could have easily treated, surrounded by slaves he had comforted, still trying to pray, even as fever consumed his mind. His death was mourned by those who had known him, a rare thing in the camps where most deaths passed unnoticed. Torvin, the tech priest whose augmentations had been removed, never recovered from the trauma of losing his mechanical components. Without his augmetics, he was diminished both physically and psychologically. He eventually threw himself into the furnaces, choosing death over continued existence. The Orks didn't notice his absence for 3 days. The patterns repeated across millions of captives. Billions, probably, since the Orks first encountered humanity in the dark ages of space travel. Every planetary invasion, every raid on human settlements, every successful Ork assault produced its harvest of slaves. and among those slaves were always some who had been wealthy, important, powerful in their former lives. Their fate was always the same: a fall into horror, a gradual erosion of identity, and an end that came too late for mercy, but too soon for any hope of rescue. The broader implications, what this tells us about the universe. The fate of wealthy humans in Ork captivity reveals fundamental truths about the galaxy in which they live. This is a universe where abstraction provides no protection, where social constructs have no power outside their specific context, where the veneer of civilization is tissue-thin over a reality of brutal pragmatism. The Imperium builds elaborate hierarchies. It creates systems of nobility and merchant houses and religious authority. It insists that certain people are more important than others based on birth or wealth or title. But these systems exist only because the Imperium is powerful enough to enforce them. Remove that enforcement, expose citizens to Xenos who don't recognize imperial authority, and the entire structure reveals itself as pure theater. This is grim, certainly, but it's also honest in a way that much of imperial propaganda is not. The Imperium likes to tell its citizens that they matter, that their contributions are valued, that their status has meaning. But the reality is that all of that is conditional on the Imperium's continued ability to protect them. The moment that protection fails, they discover that their importance was never inherent. It was granted by power structures that themselves proved impermanent. The Orks, for all their brutality, are at least honest about their values. Might makes right. Size determines status. Immediate physical reality trumps abstraction. These are brutal principles, but they're consistent and comprehensible. There's no pretense that anything else matters. A weak Ork knows he's weak and knows what that means. There's no elaborate fantasy about how his weakness is actually strength, or how he deserves respect despite his obvious inadequacy. Human society, in contrast, creates elaborate justifications for inequality. Wealth is equated with virtue. Status is presented as deserved. The lucky proclaim that their luck was actually skill or divine favor. And people believe these stories because the alternative, accepting that their position is arbitrary and temporary, is too uncomfortable to contemplate. The Ork camps reveal the lie. Strip away the protective power of the Imperium. Remove the context that makes wealth meaningful. And what remains? Humans reduced to their most basic characteristics: their physical strength, their pain tolerance, their utility for immediate tasks. All the elaborate stories about inherent worth and deserved status evaporate like morning mist. This is why the wealthy suffer so much more than the poor when captured. They have further to fall. The worker who relied on their hands already knew that abstract concepts like status were luxuries. The merchant who relied on abstract wealth never learned that lesson until it was catastrophically too late. Their entire identity was built on sand, and the tide of Ork invasion washed it away to reveal nothing beneath. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. This famous formulation captures a fundamental truth. The universe doesn't care about human constructs of value and meaning. It operates on principles of raw power and survival. The Imperium's elaborate hierarchies, its systems of wealth and status, its careful distinctions between noble and common, all of this exists only in the spaces where humanity is strong enough to maintain it. Step outside those spaces, fall into the hands of Xenos who don't recognize human authority, and you discover that you never mattered in the way you thought you did. Your wealth was never real in any absolute sense. Your status was never inherent. Your importance was only ever a story others agreed to tell. And when the others changed, the story ended. This is the lesson written in the broken bodies of slaves in Ork camps across the galaxy. This is the truth that wealthy captives learn too late to save them. This is the horror that makes death seem like mercy, not the physical suffering, though that is terrible enough. But the understanding that everything they built their lives around was illusion. Conclusion: remember their names, but know that no one will. The story of what happens to wealthy humans in Ork captivity is not unique. It repeats endlessly across the galaxy, a pattern as reliable as the stars themselves. Wherever the green tide flows, wherever Ork raids strike, wherever the greenskin menace overwhelms human defenses, the same story plays out. The wealthy fall alongside the poor, the important are enslaved alongside the insignificant, and the Orks don't care about the distinction. Coordinator Hieronymus Valdane will never be remembered. His name appears in no records, honored in no memorials, mourned in no ceremonies. The same is true for Justinia Marek, for Kyrios, for Malika, for all the countless others who experienced similar fates. They died as anonymous property, reduced to raw materials and recycled components. The universe moved on without noticing their passing. This anonymity is perhaps the final cruelty, the last insult to people who spent their lives cultivating recognition and status. They wanted to matter, to be remembered, to leave some mark on the galaxy that would outlast their physical existence. Instead, they were erased so completely that it was as if they had never existed at all. But perhaps, in some small way, their stories matter for what they reveal. They show us the fragility of civilization. They demonstrate the temporary nature of status and wealth. They remind us that the structures we build to give life meaning exist only because we collectively agree to maintain them. And that agreement can shatter in an instant when confronted with forces that don't share our values. In telling these stories, we bear witness to suffering that would otherwise be invisible. We acknowledge that these people existed, that they endured horrors beyond comprehension, that they deserved better than the fate the uncaring universe delivered. It doesn't change anything. It doesn't bring them back or ease their suffering. But it means that for a moment, however brief, someone recognized that they were here, that they mattered, that their pain was real. The Orks will continue their rampage across the galaxy. More humans will fall into their hands. More wealthy merchants and noble lords will discover that their carefully accumulated status means nothing in the face of brutal pragmatism. The cycle will continue because that is the nature of this dark universe, where war is eternal and suffering is currency. But we can remember that each victim was a person. Each captive had dreams and fears, and a life that meant something to them. The fact that the universe didn't care, that the Orks couldn't comprehend human concepts of value, that wealth and status provided no protection, none of that erases the fundamental humanity of those who suffered. In the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But in the spaces between the battles, in the quiet moments before the next assault, in the brief respites from constant violence, we can choose to remember. We can acknowledge that wealth didn't save them, that status didn't protect them, that everything they thought made them important was illusion. But they were still human. They still mattered. They still deserved better than the fate they received. That is the final truth about what happens when Orks capture a wealthy human. The wealth meant nothing. The status was irrelevant. The carefully built identity dissolved like dreams at waking. What remained was suffering and eventual oblivion. And the universe's complete indifference to both. Remember them not because they were wealthy or important, but because they were human and they suffered. Remember that the universe they inhabited was crueler than death, and that death, when it finally came, was the closest thing to mercy they would know. If you found this exploration of the grim darkness valuable, please like and subscribe. Share this with anyone who needs to understand the true horror of the galaxy we inhabit, where all the wealth in the Imperium can't buy a single moment of safety when the green tide comes calling. Thank you for watching, and may the Emperor protect you from the fate we've discussed today, though we both know that protection is far from guaranteed.